Hello and welcome to the J plus R movie podcast. We will be discussing Trick or Treat, the 2000s horror anthology Halloween film that was released in the late 2000s and released like direct to video, but has since become a cult film. To give you a basic plot setup, below several different stories taking place all around the same time on the same night of Halloween. We follow a serial killer principal. We follow these kids who decide to play a prank on an autistic girl. We follow these girls who are trying to pick up men, and the reason why is for something that's revealed at the end. And finally, we have a story about this old hermit who is kind of terrorized at his house by Sam, a character who appears all throughout the film in brief little spurts. Definitely see why it's considered a cult film, because it is absolutely the Halloween theme is so in your face that it very much feels like a celebration of that holiday, and it also feels like writer-director Michael Dougherty has a very clear love of the horror genre, and I would say he works in quite a few homages, especially at the beginning. Like the entire opening scene is kind of almost like a remix of the opening scene of Halloween. Like we have the similar POV shot, we have a similar female victim. It's just the circumstances were a lot different, and I appreciated that that love was there, but he still managed to come up with stories that were fairly predictable, that had a lot of twists, and were quite enjoyable to see play out.
I really loved the film personally. They played really well with horror cliches, and it kind of took a lot of characters we know and a lot of situations that were similar, completely turned them on their heads and pushed them in different ways. And there were a lot of times where you thought you knew what was going to happen, because that's just how the horror genre works. And what actually happens was way scarier. And I really appreciate that about the film, because it's quite rare for a horror film to make me go, oh shit, hello.
And not just in the jump scare way, but also in just the kind of narrative and story way. Because one thing that is very clear about the film is that Dougherty put a lot of effort into the sort of non-linear narrative structure. Because when you think about it, it is quite a complicated story in terms of its chronology and the placement of the stories. Like how the first story is in fact the last.
I think that the structure of it is.
Give an example in terms of how it's structured all throughout. Up until we get to the final storyline, the one that focuses on Mr. Krieg, the hermit, it's fairly intercut. We're getting, particularly with the Laurie storyline, with the girls, that's intercut with the first two stories, and through a reveal that it's actually very closely connected with another story as well. There's stuff like that, but there's other even more subtle things. You see the couple who are in the prologue. We see them later on during the second story, I think it is, or during the girls' story. We see them briefly as members of the crowd that this woman briefly speaks to. At the end, it's made very clear that all of these storylines have now kind of all converged, because we see all of the characters almost in the same frame.
Really good intersection, actually, of the stories. Throughout the thing, the whole thing is connected, which makes you think about all the stories at the same time. I would say the film always has two climaxes. Those dual climaxes really work, because we're never allowed to forget about any of the side stories. It's an anthology that actually really comes together, and although they are separate stories, it would work on their own anyway. Mm-hmm. When you get the connections, they're really nice.
Stories being connected the way they are does make sense, because all of them have very similar themes, and all of them also have that linkage of the Sam character who we see throughout the film, these brief little moments, because Sam just always seems to be just observing these events, and he's this kid in a pumpkin mask. It's a really good bit of costume design, because it's both very innocent looking, but also very airy and powerful. And it's a burlap sack that almost looks like a pumpkin head. That's kind of what it looked like to me. It's such a striking costume, and he just appears briefly. You're just wondering who the hell he is and what the hell he's doing. And in the final story, what you really get the sense of is that basically he's the Halloween mascot, in the if someone breaks tradition, he basically punishes you for it.
He almost feels like the defender of the Halloween spirit, the fun, protective side of it.
That's made very clear in the final storyline, where he's basically breaking into Mr. Krieg's home, just unleashing hell upon him, but at the end does let him live as a way of scaring him straight, and that was something that was surprising to me. I assumed that he was going to get killed, just what it seems like. At the end of it, he actually lets Mr. Krieg live, only under the assumption that he will continue to, well, not continue to, but that he will actually be nice to trick-or-treaters. I mean, he probably knew about the spirits of the children that were going to come back and get revenge on him, but he at least let him learn that lesson, I guess you could say.
Yeah. I think one thing that I really want to kind of say about the film is, to me, I think it treated each story as a separate thing. The tone of the film was really, really consistent. All throughout, we got this sense that there was more going on and there was something weird about the town. And it all seemed to kind of go back to the very first trauma with the boys on the school bus. Since then, things have been weird, is why Halloween is so important to that town, which kind of seems like a weird detail to start with. But then when you get into all the stuff that happened in that town on Halloween, you start to kind of get it.
It shows that like past event of the kids like accidentally dying. And obviously, it turns out to have definitely happened and not just be a legend. So you do have the idea that that is the earliest thing that happened. I don't necessarily think that there's an indication of how long these various supernatural elements have existed in this world, but there is a sense that there is a history. Well, you get the history element, I would probably say, in every story.
Every story seems to have some sort of age-old tradition or past trauma or something along those lines.
The killer principal, obviously, has been doing this for a while, and he's been raising his son the same a while. The girls who turn out to be werewolves, they've been doing that stuff for a while. And the Ghost Kid storyline, there's that stuff, which is kind of fairly self-explanatory. And then at the end, you have the reveal that Mr. Krieg was the driver of the bus who was basically asked to kill all of these kids. And, you know, he's kind of been living unpunished for years. And then the ghosts, they come back and they end up killing him at the end. I think the storytelling is very solid. I think although the stories are very brief, they do manage to, like, explore some somewhat, like, complicated issues that could probably sustain a whole film on their own.
I don't feel like we lost anything with them being brief. That's the important part for me. I didn't feel like the brevity of each story took anything away from them. In fact, I think it helped that sense of cohesion into each story, and we didn't have time to get too into each story. So we got an emotional through line that was actually connected really well between the intercuts, because you had panic connected with panic, or you had a bit of uneasiness connected with a bit of uneasiness. It helped us be emotionally consistent so we could switch through quite dynamically. Each story was shot slightly differently within the conventions of its individual subgenre of horror.
There are some bits where the direction does change up depending on the scene. I wouldn't necessarily say the change was that noticeable. I think for the most part it looked very similar.
I said the cinematography, not the direction. It's a bit it's quite different because the way, from the way things are lit to the points of focus and the kind of way we focus on them, I would say it was very different. The Haunted House film, that was very, very heavily shadowed. Shots were very, very close on Mr. Krieg throughout, and we were really focusing mostly on his face. And you only really saw a wide when we thought it was over. Obviously, you got barely any light, literally just a couple shards through, and that was pretty much it. Except, obviously, with the big fire with the pumpkin. That's the tone it set. With the werewolf, it was a lot of wells, you had a lot of shots of nature, and you had things more like about sexual awakenings and things like that.
Yeah.
Which is very much a part of the werewolf subgenre, and they really took time to linger on the bodies and the fetishization of the female form. So you were like, okay, cool. They're going to go down the traditional women who are kind of more about premarital sex and things like that being murdered, and you're like, oh shit, that's not where that went at all. But you kind of had that bit of that uncertainty and that almost they could keep talking a lot about Anna Paquin's character needing to lose her virginity almost, which again is the same puberty themes that come along with the werewolf story, which was really quite interesting. When you've got the serial killer film, it is very much a man worn down by neurosis and a kind of Monster Next Door sort of vibe. For the most part, you've got those fairing lights. You can always see the principal's face really well because the horror comes from his casual callousness, and then the fact that when we see him worried, it's in response to things like the neighbour looking at him through a tiny crack that you can't see, or it's more about the fact that his ears get a bit ruined by the guy vomiting blood than it is about the kid vomiting blood. So that's kind of like oh dear, because that horror setting. Obviously, the first one shot, like you say, it's very much a homage to Halloween in the way that it's shot, and then you get a little bit of, the way that the bodies are posed, just reminds you of a slasher film.
I think the fact that it is subtle is definitely an aspect of praise because these stories do have different tones, but it doesn't necessarily feel like you're jumping. Each storyline feels very tonally similar despite being tonally different. And I would say that each of the stories do have an element of dark humor to them.
For example, the neuroticness of the head teacher serial killer is hilarious because we usually see the serial killer as quite a composed, put together sort of character. That don't get me wrong, is a vicious murderer, but at the same time, with a fictional serial killer, outside of slasher, but an actual serial killer, you expect them to almost have this supernatural ability to get their way out of most situations, and then you meet this guy,
an incompetent, or maybe not incompetent, but a somewhat incompetent, fairly nerdy American dad, essentially, as a serial killer. And there's humor with that stuff when he's telling the son to go away. Like he's having a very casual conversation with his son as he's like burying the body. He's clearly trying to get his son to stop interrupting him. And he's doing the same with like Mr. Creed. And there is like definitely something funny about that. And the only story that really doesn't have anything that's like humorous about it, I'd probably say, is just the Ghost Kid storyline, but I can understand why. But the other storylines do have something about them that is humorous. The werewolf storyline, it's kind of funny because you kind of realize in retrospect, especially, that the girls weren't pretending to be talking about having sex. They were legitimately talking about wanting to eat people, but they were doing so in a way to where you could easily just confuse it with them wanting to pick up and have sex with men.
I think a lot of people come from the way it messes with your expectations of a horror film, and then kind of makes fun of you for having the expectations in the first place.
Even in the Mr. Creek storyline, it's almost like a take on the whole jerky old man who has kind of lost his spirit, regains his spirit. The kind of storyline that you'd see in like A Christmas Carol and other various films, about somebody who's like all bitter and cynical, and then they become full of heart. This is very much the horror version of that, where it's like he basically gets his home invaded and gets like abused a lot by this figure that's supposed to represent Halloween. This person isn't taking them back in time to their past, like doing stuff to like renew their hope. He's basically just coming in and just saying, hey, because you scared away some trick-or-treaters, I'm going to scare the shit out of you. And there is something funny about that.
Yeah, it almost has that I know what you did sort of element to it.
It's definitely a film that you can either watch for horror or that you can watch for fun. In terms of like the subversion of your expectations, one that was quite predictable to me was the fact that the kid was also being raised to be a killer. I saw that coming.
I'm going to be honest, I did not.
I didn't entirely see it coming, but I did think to myself, okay, why is he being so cavalier about his dad looking like he's in the middle of burying his body? But I sort of rationalized it to myself by saying, oh, he's just a kid.
I just kind of went, oh, he's a kid. I just assumed his dad's digging around the backyard or something.
There are definitely some other twists and turns that weren't entirely predictable to me. And I think the biggest one, and this is a bit of a flaw, was the principal turning out to be the guy in the mask pretending to be a vampire.
Yeah, that was an unexpected one.
I would say that was probably the only one of the connections that felt a bit forced.
Yeah, I did kind of sit there and go, wait, why the hell would he just change his MO to go for like random people on the net?
I was thinking about that, and I was also thinking to myself, he put so much effort into hiding that body, why would he be okay with just leaving a body out in the street? That just sort of seemed strangely out of character, and...
If that had just been a normal murder, it would have made perfect, like, just from some rando, or like a different connection, I think it would have made more sense. Say if that had actually tied back to, like, the very first scene, and the husband has turned out to be the vampire serial killer all night. That would have made more sense.
The husband in the first story was kind of going to be a bit of a pervert. I mean, he was openly being so because his wife okayed him to watch that porn videotape. I think that probably would have made more sense because with the principal, I mean, it felt more like that was there as a connection, but also as a way to like punish him so that he wouldn't escape unpunished. I feel like that could have just been done a different way. I mean, it was satisfying, don't get me wrong. I did really like that scene. The girls reveal themselves to be werewolves. The lead up to it was really solid, like with how Laurie takes him out off screen and then is kind of encouraged to do this thing that she's been basically like groomed to do, which is just turn into a werewolf and kill him. It was a really well done scene. It was really well directed. I really liked the element of camera emphasizing, as you said, the bodies and there being this element of sexuality and also power as well.
Really good werewolf design.
Yeah, I thought they were good.
best I've seen, to be honest. Like, I was impressed. Because I find werewolves get done badly a lot. And
it was satisfying partially because Rory was killing obviously a pretty reprehensible guy. Touch on like the Rhonda storyline. I would say that was probably the scariest story to me.
Yeah, because I think it was scary on two really important levels. One was obviously the abuse of people with the disabilities, just the callousness of that. But it kind of gave you the fear, let you think it was over, and then hit you again harder. It was both awful and great to see Rhonda just leave them all there as well.
And what's interesting as well is that there's not one reason to come up with as to why she did that. I think there were many reasons as to why she could have done that. Personally, for me, what I think it was a combination of her thinking that it was still a prank and her thinking that they'd somehow like double cross her, because they mentioned that lift could only fit 3 people on there. I think it was the 3 kids who were trying to like get on the lift with her. He was just thinking like, oh no, I want to save myself. But obviously there is also this element of, you guys pulled this like really mean, awful prank on me, and I'm not going to save you. And that is scary because it's somebody who up until that point had seemed fairly innocent. All of a sudden having this shift did feel like it came out of revenge.
It could have been either.
I kind of like how ghosts that were coming back were almost like getting revenge on those kids for basically appropriating what happened to them just for the sake of pranking another person who's implied to basically have autism. The reason why I found that scary was, I think, more for the flashback that they showed of what was happening to those like kids on Halloween, because I could actually see that happening in reality, especially like way back in the past. I could see a bunch of parents just deciding, screw it, I don't want to take care of these kids. I know this would be like my son or my daughter, but I don't want to take care of them. I just kind of want to get rid of them. So I'm going to pay this bus driver to take him out to a secluded place and just murder them. And collectively, all of these parents deciding that they do that, and that idea is just really scary. And the flashback to it was very like, it was extended, it was very moody, it was very, very well filmed. There was a good sense of build up to the actual bus falling into the water. And I think ultimately, despite the kids all wearing Halloween masks, they all felt like just these innocent victims. Stuff to me just was sad. Go ahead.
So you don't even blame him for down in the bus because he was just trying to get away.
Just
to get the car to... Oh.
Speaking of somebody who has autism, for a film that was released in the 2000s, was fairly good for its time, I have to be honest. A time when like the R word was still kind of being used very casually. It was actually kind of almost different to like be portraying even some of these like autistic kids who like do bad things. Like obviously the ghosts do kill people, but there is this level of sympathy in their actions, like they're not just monsters. They've been turned into monsters as a result of their horrible treatment.
It kind of hits because it can remind, it's almost like a crystallization of, some of society's really harsh responses to people with it. And it's big to have someone else with it. It's quite cathartic to kind of see that them get their revenge.
You think that Mr. Krieg will escape unpunished. You see him burning photos, but you don't really know what those are. But then you see, oh, okay, he was the bus driver. And you think to yourself, like, okay, so he's just going to get away with like a slap on the wrist, but he doesn't. The ghost children show up and are implied to basically like kill him. Even though obviously Krieg was under threat the entire time during that climax, and then he lived, it made it okay that he didn't actually live. It's a thing I noticed in a couple of the stories, especially with the kids, because one of them felt bad for pulling that prank on Rhonda. But when you combined both of them, sort of almost saying like, yeah, you can feel sorry or you can do something to slightly make up for it, but at the end of the day, you're still going to get punished if you do bad shit.
I feel like the bus driver deserved it way more than the kid did.
Because the kids were, at the end of the day, just pulling a prank. It was a mean prank, but it was a prank. But the driver basically tried to kill all of them, so, and he lived and they died. Yeah.
I felt bad for 2 of the kids. The girl, fuck it, she should have died. Fuck it.
I agree.
But I felt more sorry for the little boy who was clearly in on the prank, but almost seemed a bit challenged himself. Challenged, I meant like socially. He felt like the kind of kid who didn't really have a lot of friends and kind of was made to go along with it, especially because he got the shit job of being eaten. The guy who was clearly meant to be the romantic interest, I didn't feel that sorry for because he was just stringing her along.
Oh, him.
Like a little shit. But
it's probably the longest as well, so it feels the most developed and fleshed out. Filmmaking-wise, I thought it was really solid. It did have a polished look to it, but I was kind of okay with that because it had a lot of style when it had enough of that like Halloween spirit where it didn't just feel like a movie.
It prioritized visual clarity, so it looked very polished, but it didn't remove from the fear, so I didn't mind.
There were still some very like suspenseful sequences, like like that entire bit, even when before it's revealed to be a prank. That part was pretty damn intense. There are a few jump scares in the film, and some of them are false ones, but a lot of them I thought were effective. I liked how the film utilized its like violence as well, because it's not actually that violent, but there is a sort of like aggressive quality to the violence that does occur that is sometimes used for catharsis, and when it's used for catharsis, it works well, and it kind of also helps that the film doesn't have any on-screen deaths. Actually,
You know they probably died. You don't see a lot of them.
the one that you see most on screen is the principal getting killed because like he gets his like neck bitten. But even then, we still don't actually see the death. We just see the act of violence happen. It has this like effect of being violent, but not necessarily to the point to where it becomes like cartoonish ever. I did have one like other slight gripe. It's that some of the dialogue was a little bit on the nose. Um, I'm thinking especially like in the first scene where you have the couple, and then the dialogue there I thought was very, very unsubtle. Especially like when she just outright says, "Hate Halloween," or when they're saying like, somebody could punish you for blowing out that jack-o'-lantern, and she's like, well, it's Halloween, not Hanukkah. I mean, I don't think there's going to be anybody here who will punish me. But then you find out later on that Sam, came in, killed her. And there's some other dialogue as well that is a little bit unsubtle and on the nose.
I get it with the thing of, oh, it's Hanukkah, not Halloween. No one's gonna come kill me here. Some unsubtle dialogue's not so bad. Like there's instances where it's fine. And I think I hate Halloween is just fine as a line. A bit like people we hear every year going, I don't really like Christmas. It's a thing that happens, and I think it works in the context of the argument because she's very much just going, we're going to bed. Shut up.
Dialogue that's kind of a bit more metaphorical isn't necessarily like subtle it's in the metaphor angle, like especially when there's the reincorporation of the line my what big eyes you have, which I think is a line from Little Red Riding Hood that they kind of incorporate in a couple of different ways. I mean, it's incorporated well. I necessarily say it's like that subtle in regards to the metaphorical nature of like particularly of the werewolf storyline. But at the same time, I don't think it's bad because I do feel like there is something under the surface. There is something actually there, and it's not just kind of like pretending to be deeper than it is as well. Who do you think was the standout of the cast?
Anna Paquin was pretty good.
I thought she was fine. I thought she suited the innocent role very well. I liked her chemistry with the actress who was playing the sister as well. It was kind of funny because it was a very like sweet relationship because the sister was always like looking out for her and telling her like, "Oh, come on, you can do this, Laurie. You can go out and meet these men. Just take it slowly. It's going to be okay." And that was funny when you took into account that they were trying to like find and eat people, and potentially innocent people as well. I mean, at most they're probably just killing perverts, and maybe they are killing, like we know at the end, a serial killer. But I'm sure there are some innocent people in the mix, so they're not really like good. But that was kind of it managed to find like a somewhat sweet undercurrent.
How did the shop assistant do to anyone?
And there are other people who are dead in that bit, so we don't know what the hell their deal was. But to me, it was well acted. I thought they had like good chemistry with each other. Brian Cox was really good. He kind of did this good job at playing. I mean, he didn't give away the fact that he was formerly a psychopath who tried to kill children. He just sort of seemed like a curmudgeonly old man. And he even did a good job at making me almost feel bad for him when he was getting attacked, because he sort of, his power was clearly going away and he was just becoming an innocent old man. Whoever played Sam, that kid did a pretty good job as well. It was a mostly physical role, but I thought he did well.
My final thoughts on it, I think it was a really solid, well shot, well acted film that was basically 5 short films weaved together. That created an overall pretty scary feeling and made me realise, holy shit, do I not want to visit that town?
I wouldn't say it's one of the best horror films I've ever seen, but it is a very good one. I would say, especially for a 2000s horror film, it's a lot better than most of them. I mean, obviously there are some like cult classics in there, and this is kind of a cult classic, but it is also a legitimately good film. It's a very, very good Halloween viewing because it is just so heavily steeped in the Halloween mythos. So next episode, we are going to be discussing 2 films called Dead of Night. One, a 1945 British horror anthology, and the other, a American made-for-TV movie also a horror anthology. So yeah, I mean, can you think of a lot of great horror films that came out that decade? I mean, there are a few.
Hostel wasn't bad. Although then again, I wouldn't say it was as good either. I don't know. I think the best horror films that came out of that era were mostly the torture porn ones. I hate supernatural horror. It's one thing that I really don't like. I don't think it's ever done that well. To the early 2000s, and still now, it's very almost like satanic horror at the moment. It's like, you get like possession by some demon or some shit. No, that's just, I'm always just there like, skip. Well, it really pissed me off in Hereditary as well. I was kind of into that film for the first hour, and then when it became a demonic threat, I just stopped caring. Cool, great, because it was shaping up for me to be a really good psychological horror, and then I was just like, well, that was shit.
I don't agree, but I see what you mean. I don't hate supernatural horror or anything, but I do agree that a lot of it can be really cliched and recycled found footage, maybe with stuff like Wreck or Cloverfield or.
Yeah, I would agree with you on found footage horror. I think that has been really, really good in the last decade.
No, well, I've always good in the 2000s, not so much in the 2010s. But that's when it was more of a new thing, but it got kind of oversaturated later on.